The modern flight sim is a software engineering marvel. You can take off from more or less anywhere in the world and go find your house, which, hang on, no, this is the internet, that's a stupid idea. You can go and find a previous dwelling place at which you may or may not have lived and certainly don't live anymore. Take note, any crazed internet stalkers. But I say the modern flight sim, and that feels like something that kind of needs some sort of definition here. So the modern flight sim for me has two main attributes. One of which is that it features what feels very much like real-world terrain, with all its hills and undulations, and, either through satellite imagery or some clever auto-generated scenery based on, say, OSM data, has real-world buildings. But there's another dimension to this beyond just what you see on screen, and that's how it flies. For me, a true modern flight sim has some sort of fluid dynamics-based model, either the model that's been in Microsoft Flight Simulator since about 2022, or X-Plane's rather famous blade element theory. But I'm not looking so much at where these are now. I want to look at where did these things start, and with one convenient shelf reach, I should have positioned that better. I would posit that the modern flight sim begins here, with Flight Unlimited. But before I get to Flight Unlimited, I need to cover a little bit of Flight Unlimited's own history. See, PC gaming for me started in what I loosely call the 286 era, based on that being the typical hardware requirement. This notional 286 era was a big step on from what PC games had been like through the 80s, where PC was considered to mean an IBM 5150, maybe with a couple of RAM upgrades, but resulted in games which were often firmly in 4-colour CGA. As in the early 90s, developers started to make use of some of the hardware which had come to PCs towards the end of that decade, the VGA card, the Adlib and Sound Blaster, and for those who had a lot to spend on what is admittedly a very good synthesizer, the Roland MT32. In the UK at least, this fit into the wider 16-bit home computing era. A 286 with VGA and Sound Blaster would trade blows with an Amiga 500 or an Atari ST, being better at 3D and, dare I say it, point-and-click adventures, but certainly worse at things which required sprites, fast-moving action, or lots of digitized sound. This is probably going to cause arguments between supporters of those main machines. Look, they traded blows all right. Whichever one you liked was the best, it's fine, I don't care. Head off those. Head that off. Let's refocus. But having finally pushed the boundaries beyond the humble XT, some developers were not content to end things there. One of these was Looking Glass Technologies, who I knew for Car and Driver, which was a little boundary pushing with an SVGA mode, Garot shading, and if you had enough memory, texture mapping. I did not. But they were far more famous in the early 90s for Ultima Underworld. A game which really did push the boundaries, and you certainly weren't running on a 286. Well, that's enough. Comparing games, it's time to take you into the virtual world. And now that we're in said virtual world, it's time to get rid of all this modernity and drop in some more vintage hardware. Now, I've chosen this one deliberately because, for me, if the 286 era was my introduction to PC gaming, the clock-doubled 486 era is one of its most definitive. When you first encountered one of these things, if you were used to a 286, they felt absolutely invincible. Your entire game library would run at full frame rate with maximum detail. Indeed, if your game library included Test Drive 3, it would run faster than maximum frame rate and become unplayable. So you got to this point where new games came out and everything was texture mapped, and the 486s could do all of this, and I say this as someone who remembers trying to run NASCAR racing on a 20 MHz 386. That was an experience. Oh, it's probably time I got this lurching narrative back to flight simulators, and through the 286 era, they had mostly looked like this. And this was fine, this was enjoyable, I enjoyed playing this. Let's not come here to stick the boot into Flight Simulator 3. It was fun, but if you had a 486, it didn't really look that impressive. And yes, Microsoft did have, by this point, Flight Simulator 5, and you fire up Flight Sim 5 and you get the default scenario around Meigs filled, and it does look impressive. You're like, that looks like what I imagine Chicago would look like as a UK child in the 90s who's never been there. But still, even though this was impressive when you first booted it up, navigate to one of the other airports and locations and you were kind of flying over a formless flat expanse, no matter how nicely it was texture mapped. Looking Glass co-founders Paul Neurath and Ned Lerner had for quite some time wanted to do for flight sims what Ultima Underworld had done for dungeon crawling, although they weren't quite sure what form that flight sim should take, although considered that maybe another general aviation sim along the lines of the existing Microsoft Flight Simulator would be about right. But physics programmer Seamus Blackley had different ideas. He had a particular disappointment with the existing world of flight sims, and that was that, as an amateur pilot, he could see things done at air shows that the existing simulators just couldn't do with their relatively basic physics engines. He wanted to build an acrobatics flight sim, reasoning that if you got the feeling of being in the air in a small craft correct, then you would also be able to pull off all those loops, rolls and spins. Working with some of the team from Ultima Underworld, this became Flight Unlimited. See, got there in the end. Now let's talk about that game. And here's where I divert into a slightly personal note, because Flight Unlimited for me is a little bit one that got away. I lost the CD sometime in sort of 97, and so coming back to it now as something that I haven't played for, I'm not going to calculate the years, that's going to make me sad. There's bits of it that I remember really well, like this diegetic menu where you're actually at the airfield and you wander around interacting with globes and models, and something that I had forgotten but the memory came back very swiftly, which is the fighting machine that just won't shut up. Ever. That fighting machine is not in fact a minigame, or perhaps it is, because it lets you access one of the oddest credits that I've seen in a game with this plate of jelly. This is where people are going to go, they're American developers, actually that should be called Jello, or perhaps gelatin dessert if you don't want to tread on anyone's trademark, but look, I'm British, it's jelly. But aside from the potential to cause an international diplomatic incident in 2023, this was kind of fit in the game's whole style, which is it just screamed physics at you. Especially once you started trying to throw the jelly around and see what could go wrong. I'm sure once I managed to get the vertices inside out, but the slight choppiness of this 3D menu hinted at a slight issue that even though we bought this game to show off what a 486-66 could do, it was kind of already beyond the capabilities of that machine. Indeed, you could only really run it at 320 by 200 in minimum detail, and even then the full-screen virtual cockpit had a somewhat vintage frame rate. I fear for quite how nauseating the experience would have been with one of the vintage virtual reality space hats that Flight Unlimited claimed to support. But this was the thing, in the UK at least, these were expensive machines, and the closer to the bleeding edge you got, the more exponentially expensive they became. Often by the time someone you knew got what you thought was a new and powerful computer, it was in the grand scheme of things a mid-range CPU at best, and so even though we were buying a game to show off what we thought was a brand new powerful computer, that had already been eclipsed. The software world was already moving on to the Pentium. But we kind of didn't care, because even running at 320 by 200, even with the detail turned all the way around, even with that slightly choppy frame rate, this felt like the future. And just look at it. Rolling terrain, aerial photos, and of course, brilliant aircraft handling. This was very much the thing for me, loading this up after a number of decades I don't want to mention. Unlike so many games of my youth where I kind of end up a bit disappointed, this felt genuinely great to play. The flight model is brilliant, even by current standards. Okay, it might be lacking a little bit in fidelity for outright simulation, but it's still a lot of fun. These maps might be tiny, and you don't have to fly for long before you start seeing the same airport again, but they still feel great to fly around, even if I do sometimes have issues finding the airfield after I've taken off. But let's talk a bit about that terrain, because this was the mid-90s. You couldn't just go on the internet and download everything from OpenStreetMap, and the global terrain data to 30-metre or even better resolution just didn't exist. So how did the Flight Unlimited team put this together? Well, the answer is photogrammetry. They would take a small number of aerial photos taken from slightly different locations, and knowing where they were taken from, look at the differences between them to figure out what the elevations were. And, of course, having aerial photos to hand, that then gave them a handy texture to layer over the whole map. Even this approach was ambitious for the time, and the developers talk about having a Pentium stuffed in the corner of their office, which just sat there crunching data to produce the various maps spread across the US and one in France. But it worked. Even at this low resolution and low frame rate, this felt so much better to fly over than a featureless flat polygon. I mean, okay, you don't have navigation instruments and you can't exactly fly longer than a commute to the shops, but for the feeling of flight and flying above something, this really works. Flight Unlimited really lent into this. It didn't try to be one of these simulations where you can cross the continent with accurate air traffic control and radios and navigation aids and that. It really focused on just flying acrobatics and doing things in the air above a single small location. And the presentation of these tutorials is great, with lovely explanations of what you're expected to do, and when you're flying, not only do you have a helpful tutorial arrow telling you where to go, but the instructor will also grade your manoeuvre and tell you what you got right, or in my case usually, what you got wrong. And there's a reason that this works so well, because this was one of the first flight sims to have a fluid dynamics-based flight model. X-Plane, I think the first version actually came out around the same time as this, but that was a very obscure, very expensive, semi-professional flight sim, whereas this was indeed a game that you could buy on shelves, and many people did. It was enormously successful for Looking Glass. But what makes that different? Well, up until this point, flight sims had relied on these sort of very simple flight models, which used tables of data and kind of just interpolated values between them to figure out how much lift you should have for any given situation. But that leads to something that feels kind of very static. You really are just flying through arbitrary 3D space. Whereas with a fluid dynamics model, that takes the actual shape of the plane and simulates fluid passing over it. This was incredibly ambitious, there's that word again, for a 486, so Seamus Blackley, programming the physics for this, did a lot of optimization, including transforming between different coordinate spaces so that the very gnarly fluid dynamics equations that he had to use would be a little less taxing on the CPU. But what this means is that if you get the shape of the plane about right, then it flies about right. Blackley was very proud of the idea that if you put a chair into the simulation, it would drop out of the sky like, well, a chair. Now, of course, there are compromises here, so Flight Unlimited very much goes for the idea of what feels right rather than what necessarily is right, and while most of the time you won't notice it, there are occasional things where you go, I'm not sure a plane would do that. Certainly the rate at which they lose speed, which is rather drastic when you don't have the throttles up. But what this means for gameplay is a game which really does feel like flying, or well, as close to it as I can guess, based on the fact that I've only ever sat in the back as self-loading cargo. It feels like you're piloting the plane through some kind of fluid. I mean, fluid there is air, it's kind of in the name, aircraft. This is particularly noticeable when you switch to the glider, where the air really does feel alive. You can catch lift as you soar over ridges, you can track thermals, and indeed, one of the biggest challenges I had flying the glider was a particularly obnoxious thermal, which kept kicking me aloft as I was trying to approach the runway. And this is all stuff that fluid dynamics model makes really seamless, in a way that a table-based one can sometimes feel a bit canned and false as you switch between one operating mode to another. One pleasant surprise, as someone who only ever got to play this in choppy 4860 vision, is it does scale really rather well. Cranking up the speed in DOSBox, it allows me to turn on all the options, have a fantastic resolution by 1990s standards, and still play at a very smooth frame rate. It doesn't suffer too many CPU speed issues, apart from models in the menu rotating at a little bit of a clip, shall we say. However, one slight drawback of things in the distance no longer being a blurry mess of pixels is you can see how small the maps are, often being able to see the runway repeating in the distance as you're flying over it in the foreground. But still, this doesn't really matter for what's mostly a game about acrobatic flying, and certainly nobody really cared at the time, and Flight Unlimited really did hit at just the right time, a very ambitious, hardware-pushing game at a point when people had hardware they wanted to show off. It sold incredibly well, and given that this was Looking Glass's debut as a self-publisher, couldn't have turned out better. Sadly, the follow-ups didn't do quite so well. There was oddball voxel terrain-based first-person shooter Terra Nova, and attempt to revolutionise the world of golf the same way they'd revolutionised the world of flight sims with British Open Championship Golf, and both of those did kind of about as well as you'd expect given my cynical tone. And sadly, Looking Glass's run as a self-publisher ended with not very much in the bank. Flight Unlimited did get followed by a sequel, although Seamus Blackley was no longer with the company, and what turned out to maybe be a bit of a spaghetti code situation around the fluid dynamics model meant that Flight Unlimited 2 used a different system based around force vectors. But it also pushed the sim back more towards the world of general aviation, featuring a much larger area centered around San Francisco, which you could fly around and do proper VFR navigation and that, like one of those modern flight sims we've been talking about. But you know, I'm just happy to have rediscovered the original, and possibly sparked the great jelly wars of 2024, although you know that's kind of unlikely. That's really just a narrative device that I use so that I can bring the video to some kind of satisfying end, or unsatisfying end, as it may be. I just really like this game. It plays really nice. It's great to have it back. I'm kind of just pleased by this.